Ciao, buonasera a tutti gli ascoltatori.
Hello, good evening to all listeners. First of all, we would like to thank once more the Radio Koradi team, especially Elio and family, for their willingness in giving us this opportunity to transmit the Gnostic teachings. Okay, let's introduce ourselves. We are Lorena Hermosilla and my husband Gonzalo Garcia. We are a couple of Gnostic missionaries of Spanish origin. For 14 years, we have been the directors of the new Gnostic Academy, Samael Aun Weor, in Florence. Our Florence blog is www.gnosifrenze.blogspot.com. There you will find the contacts, the program of the Gnosis course, how to get to our Gnosis Center, and much more information. We also have a YouTube channel. If you want, you can also listen to public conferences from the previous year. Just write on YouTube Accademia Gnostica di Firenze or Accademia Gnostica Gonzalo Garcia and you will find our channel. Gnosis is the synthesis of the universal wisdom that has manifested itself in every time and place. When the keys to self-knowledge are lost, or when a general confusion arises between many contradictory theories, Gnosis always appears under different names. The word Gnosis comes from Greek and means knowledge, not in an intellectual sense, but rather understood as direct, intimate knowledge, as a revelation generated by the contact of our consciousness with our own being. We also deal with meditation and other disciplines relating to inner work and to the awakening of man, as well as practices for the activation of consciousness, for inner growth, alchemical, Kabbalistic, and hermetic practices, etc. Once a year, in October, we present our annual course made up of 33 weekly meetings in the public hall of the Council of Florence, in Piazza Tasso, number 7. Meetings are divided in two parts, one giving information on how to and why do inner work, and the second part with a practice with the aim of starting to build a relationship with our deep inner being. This year it will be on October the 1st at 9 p.m. with the topic Aztec and Mayan spirituality before its decline. So we are waiting for you. Today we present the conference Current Deviations from Gnostic Doctrine and Practice, Part 1. Finally, I inform you that it's possible to ask questions, which you can write at any time during the conference. For all those who want to ask questions, if you look at the page of the radio to which you are connected live, on the envelope icon in the corner, at the bottom right of the page, or at the top left of the page, above the image of the poster, always on the envelope icon, by clicking, you can send us your questions, which we will gladly answer at the end of the conference. Now, I leave the floor to my husband, Gonzalo Garcia. Thank you.
Sì, buonasera a tutti, anche da parte mia, piacere.
Yes, good evening everyone from me too. It's a pleasure. To finish with this technical part, the radio told us that for those who are using the application from their mobile phone or the Radio Koradi application, you can also write a message or send a question by clicking on the word contacts that you will see, or by clicking on the link above the image of the poster. From that link, you can also communicate with the radio to ask questions or comments, etc. Okay, so let's look at today's topic. It will be approximately 45 minutes, which we will dedicate to this first part. The purposes of this topic are many. The main purpose is that the Gnostic movement was born in 1947 or 1950, or around those dates, around that period. So more than 70 years have now passed, and this doesn't surprise us because it has always happened, but it saddens us a little to see how Master Samael's teaching is not always correctly transmitted. Or it is amputated, it is adulterated, forgotten, modified. And therefore, in more than 30 years that we've been missioning, we've been to different parts of the world and witnessed students coming from different parts and also different Gnostic institutions, and they tell us about things that they've heard which, in our opinion, are not exactly the doctrine of Master Samael. Therefore, we are also aware that there might be a lot to talk about, or that we can talk about, but for now, let's start by thanking Radio Koradi and the whole team for the opportunity they gave us. We will therefore cover this topic. We will deal with it in different parts. Thanks also to the availability of Radio Koradi. The purpose of this topic is also for those people who are not familiar or are approaching Gnostic studies for the first time. Then I would like to clarify to these people that not all those who call themselves Gnostics teach Gnosis. Even if the teaching they say they transmit comes from Master Samael Aun Weor. I am not saying that I have the truth, or that I am the only one, of course, to transmit the correct teaching of Master Samael. But everything must be said. Therefore, this is to say that not everything you hear or read on the internet is Gnosis, nor that it is the teaching of Samael Aun Weor. Therefore, the best thing is always to attend a Gnostic center in person to learn about Gnosis. Then, luckily, there are also Master Samael's books, where one can confirm whether or not what he or she is listening to is part of this teaching, or if instead they were additions, interpretations, or adulterations of the teaching. Okay, so my idea in this first part is to cover 4 points. Let's see the first one. So the first point is that the practice of the Great Arcanum must be done exclusively during the night, at night time. Obviously, I've always looked for written references where Master Samael clarifies this, because anyone who's listening to me can rightly say, but who does he think he is? Who is this guy to say that the reality of the teaching is this or that? Therefore, I will now read you a text where Master Samael clearly says that the practice of the Great Arcanum of sacred Gnostic sexuality must be done exclusively at night. You will then be able to confirm what I'm about to read in the book Tarot and Kabbalah. Chapter Da'at,
Dice così il Maestro Samael.
Master Samael says thus:
Yesod è lunare.
Yesod is lunar, and this we cannot deny. In Gnostic esotericism, a woman is shown, a divine, ineffable virgin, dressed in a blue tunic and standing upon the moon.
Questo lo dobbiamo comprendere. La luna rappresenta la Sefira Yesod.
One must know how to understand this, that the moon represents the Sephiroth Yesod,
Indica la forza sessuale.
which symbolizes the sexual force, and the tunic of a blue color represents the night, during which the great mysteries of life and death unfold.
Soltanto di notte si lavora con l'energia creatrice del terzo logos.
Only at night does one work with the creative energy of the third logos. The work in the laboratorium of the Holy Spirit must be done in the nocturnal hours.
Si deve praticare Sahaja Maituna.
The Sahaja Maituna must only be practiced in the darkness of night, because during the day the sun is opposed to generation.
Se si fanno covare a una gallina,
If one takes a hen sitting on eggs out into the light of the sun in order for the eggs to hatch, then they will not hatch, and if a chick should come out, then it will die, because the sun is the enemy of generation. Whoever wishes to seek the light must ask it of the Logos, who is behind the sun, which illuminates us in the profound night.
La cruda realtà è che per disposizione degli organi sessuali.
The crude reality is that because of the disposition of the creative organs, procreation takes place in the darkness. This is due to the fact that when the zoosperm leaves the sexual glands, it does not leave in the light of the sun, but in darkness. And in darkness enters the opening of the fallopian tube, so as to connect with the ovum, which descends from the ovaries. And gestation takes place within the darkness of the womb. If that zoosperm, however, were to pass out to the light of the sun instead of being emitted from the sexual glands, in a state where it is protected by darkness, and if the fetus were not in darkness and were to be found unprotected in the womb of the woman, so that it received the direct light of the sun, it is obvious that failure would result. Because of the very disposition of the organs of nature themselves, fecundation is always realized in darkness. So too, one must work within the obscurity of silence and in the august secrecy of the wise to be able one day to attain the intimate self-realization of the being. That is what Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, dressed in a tunic of blue and standing upon the moon, is indicating to us the work of the Maituna in the darkness of the night. Okay, so Master Samael is very clear, extremely clear in these words. To illustrate his point, he presents us with the archetype of the eternal feminine in the Christian tradition, the Immaculate Conception, and therefore how this representation, Isis, Kundalini, or Mary, indicates this kind of work with her, with the Divine Mother in the sexual waters at night, indicated by the moon at her feet, indicated by the blue cloak. Therefore, the color of the sky, the 12 stars, the stars above the head of the Immaculate Conception. So everything concerns the night. These are clearly symbols of the night, indicated also through Christian esotericism. This is not to say that the sun is a negative thing. Master Samael is only saying that the sun has the power to expand, to multiply. But that creation, as in the maternal womb or as inside an egg, is produced inside, in the dark. Also, I'd like to clarify the word darkness, not darkness in the sense of a negative thing, but in the sense of obscurity, absence of light, within which the sperm fertilizes the egg. It gestates in the mother's womb, all in the darkness of the night. Therefore, sexual magic, the sacred sexual practice, is also done exclusively at night. Because, I repeat, it's not that the sun is negative, but rather the sun, once life is created, it makes it grow, it makes it develop. Therefore, the sun has another task. Instead, if it hasn't grown yet, if it hasn't been formed, then the light would decompose that embryo or whatever we are wanting to create. In this case, our internal bodies through sacred sexuality.
Ho scelto questo primo punto, i punti sono tanti, come ho detto all'inizio.
Okay, so I chose this first point. There are many points, as I said at the beginning, certainly all important. It's not like they have an order of priority, but this was just to begin with. So I also happened to hear this from Gnostic teachers who had claimed to practice throughout the day. Not only teachers, but also directors or even international coordinators of Gnostic institutions. I've also heard some of Master Samael's direct disciples saying that they had been told directly by Master Samael himself in private that they could work during the day. So what is this supposed to mean? That the Master wrote one thing and then said another? I really don't believe this. Could it possibly be that that brother or sister didn't really understand Master Samael's words well? Because when we quote this from Tarot and Kabbalah, which we've just read, this text that I just read to you, we're not exactly talking about a book of the beginning of the Gnostic movement, where Master Samael corrected few things thanks to his initiatory process. We're actually talking about a book where Master Samael was already at a very advanced level of his process. Tarot and Kabbalah is a Christmas message, a book from the year 6970, which means that the Master was already in the second mountain. This would mean that Master Samael, in order to have reached that level, would have had to do a wrong practice up until then. So you're saying that he had also practiced during the day, and only at that point he had noticed, he had realized that it was a mistake? It wouldn't be possible, because in the second mountain he has clearly created already all the bodies. He has already done all the first mountain, all the serpents, the Kundalini, the initiations of the major mysteries, the Venusta initiations, the serpents of light. So if all of this was already done by the year 1970, which is when he wrote this, since he had already gone through those initiatory processes, then it clearly means that he must have done it that way all the way long, obviously. So this seems very clear to me. I could also talk about some of my experiences. For example, I have only tried it once in 35 years of Gnostic studies. Only once me and my wife tried alchemy during the day. And the following night, the immediate night in the internal worlds, not only was I scolded, but they actually showed me what was happening. Basically, it was a disaster. In the internal worlds, a total disorder had been created in my internal psychological space. The bedroom was a mess, the whole house turned upside down, so it was chaos. I left the house, and outside in the street everyone was crazy. The cars, the traffic, the people. They were all behaving in a very unbalanced way. So, an absolute chaos, which was very clear to me, which was the result of what I had done. Also because I felt it intuitively. I knew they were responding to that alchemical practice that we had tried to do during the day. And that we did correctly, as we always did, but with that one difference, that we had practiced it during the day instead of the night. So the sun hadn't set yet. Well, so this was enough for me not to play and not to try anymore. In fact, I don't want to talk about myself much. I don't want to continue talking about other personal experiences. But then, over time, I have had other experiences where they also clearly indicated to me why one must work with sexual energy exclusively at night, and the results that the night produces. Therefore, things I've heard, such as the day can be used to die during alchemical practice, or the day can be used to die, whereas the night can be used to create bodies. Well, Master Samael doesn't say this anywhere in the entire fifth gospel. In all of his works and conferences, rather, he says, written in that 1970 book, Tarot and Kabbalah, chapter Death, he says that we work exclusively at night, and not that something is needed during the day and something else is needed at night. You need the night to die. Alchemical practice is needed in the night to create bodies. That is, the work with sacred sexuality is only truly white alchemy, white sexual magic when it's done at night. And this would be the first point. So I won't go into too much detail about this because I think it's clear enough. And for that matter, there is also the possibility of questions at the end for those who need to ask. So a second point is something we hear even more, much more. It still reaches our ears every now and then. I can't deal with this very much since I already have enough work with my own internal work to deal with and with the students of the different chambers and groups. So I can't take much care about what one says or about what other Gnostic institutions are saying and so on. As I said at the beginning, there are people who often come from other institutions, and when we start teaching them, they say things like, "Oh, but I didn't know this, they taught me in this way," and so on. So what I'm about to say now is one of the things we hear the most still. Every year, basically, someone arrives and comes up with this story, which I'm now about to explain. So, let's continue a bit while we are on this topic of energy transmutation. In this case, it is for everyone, even for singles, that is, to transmute one's energy alone, no longer during sacred sexuality, but as a couple. So when we transmute everyone, whether single or married, we transmute our energy individually with the Hamsa mantra, with pranayama, with the different exercises or mantras that Gnosis teaches us, and so on. Well, the deviation, as I titled this conference, Current Deviations from Gnostic Doctrine and Practice, the deviation for me is this approach, this technique of transmutation, which is very poorly explained for me, very badly. And now I will also explain how it is taught according to Master Samael, and I will read a text, just as I had done before. So, the deviation is when it is explained to close the sphincters, to apply pressure and close the sphincters at the moment in which we have to transmute the sexual energy. Well, I'm going to say this first so that it can be clearly understood quickly. Now, if you have to water the plants, because that's what essentially transmuting is, it's watering the flowers, as Master Samael also said. To transmute is to water, to give nourishment to the parts of the being. So if I have to use a hose to water the plants, and I tighten the hose, I tie a knot, I press it and block it, how can I water those plants? That is, if I interrupt the passage of the water because I squeeze and press on the sphincters, I close the sphincters, it's really contradictory because it's just the opposite. It doesn't make any sense at all. That is, the sphincters, the channels, using the muscles of the sexual area, the uterus, etc., to block the sphincters. And in doing so, I also block the Ida and Pingala energy channels, where the energy rises, is precisely doing the opposite of what we are supposed to do. As a Gnostic, I want the energy to rise. I want that energy to transmute. So why would I interrupt, close, block those sphincters? It just doesn't fit into my head. It has no logic. So let's see this text. The fact of closing the sphincters concerns only the dangerous moment when we feel the approach of a possible seminal loss, whether this is about to occur as a nocturnal emission in dreams or during the practice of sexual magic. So Master Samael has always explained it like this. When he talked about closing the sphincters, it was always in relation to a risk of a fall. Because there is a risk of losing the energy. The Master says, and now we will read a text, The Mystery of the Golden Blossom, chapter 26, the Golden Embryo. So in that chapter, and in many other conferences, when Master Samael talks about closing the sphincters, It is always in the context that he is commenting, that is, if there is an imminent danger of spasm, orgasm, seminal loss. In that case, it is logical that I close everything, as the Master teaches. I close my breathing, I block my breathing, to avoid that extreme that I have reached and which has put me in danger of losing the energy. First, in no way, nowhere does Master Samael say that we must transmute by closing the sphincters. Like I said, it's just absurd, it's contrary to practice. Therefore, I'm still very sorry to hear that some Gnostic missionaries and Gnostic institutions, worse still, directors of institutions, international coordinators, even direct disciples of Master Samael, teach something different, something else. They teach this big mistake because they extrapolated this detail and they transferred it to the general practice of sexual transmutation through hamsa or other exercises or their own sexual magic, etc., etc. These are practices where the sphincters mustn't be closed or compressed in any way. Otherwise, how does the mercury rise? The sexual organs must be relaxed as well as the breathing. It doesn't have to be violent but natural. Any form of violence is contrary to love, which also requires the practice of sexual transmutation to unite with the source of love, that is, with the Divine Mother. I will now read this text by Master Samael, Mystery of the Golden Blossom, chapter 26. The consecrated woman, the Suvani, knows how to voluntarily clench the sphincter, controlling the yoni to the maximum, so as to avoid orgasm and the loss of sexual fluid. Tantric initiation teaches this way. It is appropriate at this stage to add the following. In the event that a spasm does happen unexpectedly, the man must prevent seminal ejaculation by instantly withdrawing and lying on the floor on his back. In these instances, close the right and left nostrils by sealing them with the forefinger and the thumb of the right hand. Try holding the breath in this way for as long as possible. Send the nervous current towards the sexual sphincters or escape valves with the aim of preventing spilling the vessel of Hermes. Imagine that the seminal energy ascends through Ida and Pingala up to the brain. Okay, so as you can see, as I was telling you, Master Samael comments on this detail of closing the sphincters only in this context, in this situation, in which we, because we have practiced badly, we have reached an extreme of losing the energy. So in this case, before things get worse, we must close the sphincters, we must block the breathing. That is, we must try to avoid at all costs the spasm and the orgasm, which we have dangerously come close to for many factors, for having practiced wrongly, but only in this context. And when the Master Samael repeats, and I repeat too, this point in many of his conferences, it is always in this context, that that man or that woman is on the verge of a sexual fall, and therefore he or she must close the sphincters. When the Master teaches the transmutation for singles or couples, he never says to close the sphincters. This would be anti-alchemical. That is contrary to the logic of transmutation. Because it's a question of allowing the energy to rise and not of narrowing the channel through which the energy must rise. It's pretty obvious. I'm surprised, I'm amazed sometimes at how people interpret this information. Of course, we know how much ego we have and so on, but sometimes it's not even the ego. All you need to do is read. Why do you invent these paranoias? Why does a teaching have to be adulterated? In this case of one's own, I don't know how to define it. Here it is not a lack of conscience, because there is no need to interpret anything. The Master is very clear in his explanations. Therefore, from a particular detail, this was extrapolated and transferred to the general practice. Serious mistake. And even this text that I read, I repeat, this is found in many other conferences, this text that I read is not from an early book, which doesn't mean anything, by the way. All Master Samael's books are recommendable, but we understand that obviously the latest ones are even more precise because the Master at this point was at higher levels of the initiatory path. So the mystery of the golden blossom, which is where I read this text from, is a Christmas message from the year 71-72, which means 5 or 6 years left from the end of Master Samael's process of the great work. So we're not exactly talking about a moment of, let's say, the beginning of the Gnostic movement. Okay, so I think this is also definitely clearer now. I don't think there's any need to add anything else to this point. Taking advantage of this theme of transmutation, in order to leave it now and to enter into other topics, I will add the following. One of the last things I've heard is that you don't have to transmute so much, that you don't have to transmute throughout the entire day, and that many Gnostic institutions say that transmutations shouldn't be emphasized so much. So, without wanting to sound offensive, but sometimes this makes me angry, what is their mental justification or mental paranoia for saying such types of things? So they say, above all, that we mustn't transmute so much if we are still candidates on the path. So basically those who are on the probationary pathway or in the minor mysteries with the guardian of the threshold. So basically most of the Gnostic students on the planet and also the missionaries. So why do they say this? Why do they say don't transmute? They say don't transmute because there's a risk, apparently. Don't transmute so much because it is more important to die. No, all the three factors are important every day. The three factors must be practiced as best as possible every day. So the story I heard, the justification I heard, is due to the risk of becoming or creating Hanasmussen. Well, obviously, little or a lot of transmutation without death makes you become Hanasmussen, but the problem here is the lack of death and sacrifice for humanity, not transmutation itself. It doesn't change the fact that I transmute a lot or a little. I still become Hanasmussen if I stop dying and giving my life for the being and for others. Therefore, on the contrary, the more I transmute, the more consciousness I awake. The more I transmute, the more I am in contact with the being. Sexual energy is also called Mercury in alchemy. Mercury is the god who connects Olympus with Hades, heaven and hell, as the Greek tradition teaches. Therefore, if you transmute Mercury, it takes you to Olympus, that is, in contact with the different parts of the being. And this is essential for dying. Or is it you that wants to die? That is, do you expect to die without the being? Instead, if I don't transmute, the energy accumulates inside of me. It becomes loaded with desires. It becomes an atomic weight and makes me sink further into those lower worlds in which I always live, but to which now I attach myself even more. I get closer, I experience. That is, my own Dante's circles, my own conscious. So how am I supposed to die now, according to this argument? Sexual energy allows me to activate consciousness in order to come into contact with the being, or to come into contact with the being in order to activate consciousness. After this, I can truly die. So the problem of not emphasizing transmutation so much for people who are at the beginning, because otherwise they create bodies, I wish, and they awaken Kundalini, but then become Hanasmussen because they forget to die. No, you have to teach how to die, just as you have to teach how to transmute and sacrifice yourself for humanity. So the problem of Hannes Musen is not to transmute, the problem is not to die. So focus on that and teach people on how to die. And how do I die if I don't love humanity? How do I die if I don't transmute sexual energy? Who must be willing to die? The ego? Does the ego eliminate the ego? So really another crazy theory with no foundation whatsoever in any of Master Samael's teachings. On top of that, I invite all these brothers and sisters to reflect upon that all the energy that is not transmuted doesn't disappear. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, it is transformed. So the energy that you don't transform is transformed by the ego. The ego takes it. And then you have all the problems that Gnostics experience on a daily basis, because there is a lack of transmutation of energy to begin with. So much energy left without transmuting it is like inviting all your devils to a great banquet. All your egos. It is a precious food. It is a manna, a blessing. It is ambrosia, nectar. It is soma, mercury. It's the food of the gods, that is, of the parts of the being. So if you don't give it to the gods, to the parts of the being, then one's own egos will come after it. They will all come to the party, to the banquet. They eat up all that food. And then this Gnostic student or missionary would say, oh, how badly the ego treats me, how much I suffer, how much I am tormented by lust, by envy, by greed, by jealousy, by anger. Well, why don't you start by transmuting the energy? Don't leave all that food for those egos inside of you. I mean, the egos are there anyway, you will have to find them and eliminate them. But in the meantime, you avoid them arriving like an avalanche and continuously, leaving you no escape and no time or energy even to transform them, because there are so many of them and because it's a lot of food that you have left behind. It's like if you leave food on the floor, it soon fills your kitchen or your entire house with insects. We all know that the house and the kitchen must be cleaned well, otherwise the ants will arrive, the cockroaches will arrive, all the little animals will arrive to eat that food. So it is absurd to say people who are starting out mustn't transmute so much, because there is a risk. A risk of what? The risk is not transmuting, the risk is not dying, the risk is not sacrificing yourself for humanity. So, to finish with this, and also to clarify it with the words of Master Samael, why does Master Samael say that it is necessary for Gnostics to transmute at least an hour and a half a day? Minimum. So if you teach as a missionary, or if you practice and you teach your students to transmute 5 or 10 minutes, otherwise they become an Asmussen, well, you're teaching something that is not in the Gnostic teaching of Samael Aun Weor. When the Master says an hour and a half, many have also interpreted it as if that was the goal to be reached, the maximum. No, that's the minimum, because the Master explains that that hour and a half, and it's not that we are checking the clock, obviously, it's an approximate timing to make us realize how much energy we receive every day, how much grace we receive from heaven, how much solar logos transmits prana to us, mercury, through breathing, through food, through free meals, since we breathe continuously for 24 hours, through psychological gymnastics, through transformation of impressions. So everything transforms in us into prana that we accumulate, which becomes mercury, sexual energy to be transmuted. Therefore, the help we receive from heaven is so great that it takes at least about an hour and a half to eat it up, to breathe it, to transform it, to bring it back inwards and upwards. So that hour and a half is not the finishing line. That hour and a half is the beginning, because the amount of help that the Logos donates to us every day with sacrifice is a lot. So in reality, this is just an example that Master Samael gives us in order to understand how much time is needed, how much food we receive, how much help we receive every So for those who claim that they don't receive, that they don't feel the masters, that they don't feel the divinity helping them, I say the divinity helps you so much that it penetrates you through breathing, where there's not only oxygen but prana, through food, where there's not only the physical part but the energetic and conscious part, through impressions, through psychological gymnastics, which also offers you the opportunity to extract not only understanding from your conscience, but also food for the conscience. Through that transformation of impressions, a certain quality of mercury is also produced, which is useful for those who begin and for those who have created bodies, and more for those who have to maintain them, to nourish them, etc.
Con questo il maestro intende far capire quanto ci dobbiamo occupare della trasmutazione.
So with this, the Master Samael intends to make us understand how much we have to deal with transmutation. When the Master gives the example that an immortal breathes light, that an immortal lives from the philosopher's stone, that is, he is saying that he is transmuting permanently. Well, that's a finishing line. Not even an hour and a half, which is just the minimum required to start with. That is, a person who really wants to walk on a Gnostic path will one day be constantly transmuting. Because that is what a self-realized master does. He breathes light. That is, he experiences another continuous transmutation. Obviously, at those levels, he is not necessarily thinking about Hamsa or doing pranayama. He does it too, but I mean not 24 hours a day. He transmutes and has brought that practice instinctively to his nature, so he experiences a permanent transmutation. So nothing to do with the idea of people, especially beginners, who mustn't transmute so much. This would be the same thing as when we accuse Catholics or pseudo-Christianity for teaching badly. And this would be the same, I'm sorry, fellow Gnostic brothers, this is the same thing. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to, as the words of Jesus say. By teaching Gnosis in this way, you don't enter and you don't let anyone else in.
Ok, terzo punto, cambiando un po' di argomento, la psicologia senza l'ontologia.
Okay, so third point, psychology without ontology. Psychology without ontology, we can call it like that. Well, I've also heard this a lot. It's this approach, this way of teaching psychological work, meditation, self-observation, depth of the ego, but without starting first from the being. I mean, I must first seek for the remembrance of the being, which is a state of presence. It is love for the being. It is not a thought. I must first experience the remembrance of the being. With the remembrance of the being, my consciousness is then activated. Only then I can do psychological work. Before that, it's nonsense. Master Samael got tired of teaching this in the famous conference where he says the ego cannot comprehend nor eliminate the ego. He repeats this 1,000 times. We are in need of a superior power to the mind. The mind can only label the ego, the unconscious, but it cannot comprehend it, it cannot eliminate it. So we first need a contact with the being. We must go from the ontological, that is, the science of the being, contact with the being, to the psychological. Therefore, it is the being that can study the psyche. The psyche cannot study the psyche. The psyche is self-deceived, it's asleep. So how can it study itself? The psyche just deceives herself. It maintains its fantasy. I have to get out of myself. I have to get out of my body, of my personality, out of my ego, of my unconscious. That is, out of my psyche and my mental representations. When I detach myself from all of this, then consciousness is activated because I have managed to detach myself from this. And in order to be able to detach myself from this, because I can't do anything by myself, I have first to seek for the being. There is no other way. He is the only one who can detach me from myself. We must search for the being through mysticism, through love, through prayers, through mantra, done with intensity, with fervency and with continuity, not just 5 or 10 minutes. Only long and intense practices in prayer, supplication, mantra, concentrated exclusively in the being. They allow me to do what I've just said, that is, detachment from everything that keeps me asleep.
Personalità, ego, mente.
The personality, the ego, and the mind. So after that, yes, I can talk about meditating, about studying the mind, about studying the ego, about studying the false personality, comprehending, dying, and so on. Once I've done that, once I've separated myself from myself, then the being, the Divine Mother, the path of the being, through my activated consciousness, which is activated thanks to them, can communicate to me what I need to understand, what I need to comprehend. So whoever says not to focus too much on the being because there is a risk of mythomania, because there is a danger of mythomania in thinking a lot about the being through using mysticism and prayer and so on, well, I could say to these people that without the being we already are mythomaniacs. We are in fact mythomaniacs of ourselves. There is mythomania of oneself, of the ego. We live for ourselves, so we live for the ego, inside the ego. We have made a myth out of the ego, so we already are mythomaniacs. On the other hand, it is precisely the contact with the being that can heal us from being mythomaniacs. It is precisely this contact that will allow me to discover that defect and all of the other defects or flaws.
Come ho fatto sempre anche in questo punto, leggo un testo del maestro Samael, che non è in questo caso, anche in questo caso un altro libro.
As I've always done so far, I will now read a text by Master Samael. In this case, it's another book which we all know, Revolutionary Psychology. One of the last books where Master Samael already had eliminated all the ego. And what does he say in his famous and wonderful chapter 32, Prayer in the Work? Well, the title already says it all. Without prayer, there is no work. It is not the form of prayer itself, or the form in which one prays in one religion or another. It is the intensity of consciousness that can be achieved thanks to the search for the being, through words, through mantras, through one's own words, etc. With fervency and lasting over time. 5 or 10 minutes is not enough. So Master Samael says in this chapter, prayer in the psychological work is fundamental for the dissolution of the I. We need a power superior to the mind if indeed we want to disintegrate this or that I. The mind in itself, by itself, can never disintegrate any I. This is indisputable and irrefutable. To pray is to talk with God. We must appeal to God, the Mother, in the depths of our heart if we truly want to disintegrate I's. The one who does not love his or her mother, the ungrateful child, will fail in the work upon himself. Each one of us has his or her particular individual Divine Mother. She in herself is a part of our own being, but a derivative part. Further on, Master Samael says, a specific formula in order to pray our inner Divine Mother is not necessary. We must be very natural and simple when we address her. The child who addresses his or her mother never has a special formula. The child utters what comes from his heart, and that is all. No I is instantaneously dissolved. Our Divine Mother must work and even suffer very much before achieving the annihilation of any I. Make yourself introversive, direct your prayer within, seeking within your interior your Divine Lady. Thus, with sincere supplications, you shall be able to talk to her. Beg her to disintegrate the I that you have previously observed and judged. Okay, so as he says that we have previously observed and judged, so not with the ego, with the personality, that we have observed and judged because, thanks to fervent prayer, the conscience is now activated and therefore I can observe and comprehend. And then I can ask for elimination, not before that. If there is no superior emotion, Master Samael repeats it 1,000 times, if there is no superior emotion, the superior emotion separates you from the mind, from the ego, and from the personality. So whoever thinks about doing only psychological work, well, that has nothing to do with Gnostic psychology. The internal Gnostic work is done from the ontological to the psychological. And this is the only really possible way to do it. So overly mentalistic Gnostics, pseudo-Buddhist Gnostics, pseudo-Gnostics, pseudo-Krishnamurtians and so on. No, Gnosis has been able to unite the Buddhist esotericism with the Christian esotericism. So yes to silence, yes to detachment, yes to the stillness of my will, that is Buddhism, but we also need burning heart full of love, which is Christianity. Now let's combine these two currents, which synthesize and are also synthesized in Gnosis. Only in this state it is possible to do real work on oneself, psychological, meditation and everything else. Okay, so due to the time we're at, we will now interrupt for a moment. There's another point missing, but we will now leave some space and take a break, also in the case there are any questions, after which we will gladly answer the questions, and on top of that, if there is some time left, we can also see another point. Okay, so I will now pass the word to Lorena.
Ok, grazie Gonzalo. Cari ascoltatori, ora vi lasciamo per 10 minuti di pausa.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo. Dear listeners, we now leave you for a 10-minute break. We will play some music in order to give us time to look at the questions you have sent us. If you want, you can send other questions regarding the conference by clicking on the envelope icon or at the top left of the page, above the image of the poster, or at the bottom right corner, on the envelope icon. We will connect again in 10 minutes, and we'll gladly answer at all your questions, if there are any. See you soon, and thank you.
Ciao a tutti nuovamente, allora abbiamo una domanda.
Hello everyone again. So we have a question from Patrizia. So she says, good evening Gonzalo and Lorena. Thank you for your conference. Always very interesting and useful. Can you tell me what Hanasmussen means? I don't know if I understood correctly. Okay, Patrizia, no problem. Now Gonzalo will answer. Thank you.
Bene, sì, Hanasmussen.
Okay, yes, Hanasmussen was one of the points we covered, right? So these brothers or sisters say not to transmute so much, so as not to risk becoming or creating Hanasmussen.
Bene, questo viene da un commento che aveva fatto il maestro Samael del rischio che esiste le persone che si dedicano soltanto.
So this comes from a comment that Master Samael made about the risk that exists of people who only dedicate themselves to working with the sexual energy and forget to die or to sacrifice themselves for humanity. Basically, the three factors must be done simultaneously, all three of them, because if we work exclusively with the transmutation of energy and possibly awaken the Kundalini or create bodies, but then we interrupt the initiatory process because we stop dying or stop sacrificing ourselves for humanity, then we would create, as Master Samael says, an abortion of nature. because we have created internal bodies, but now the ego is exploiting them. Therefore, if the ego already exploits the ordinary person who is asleep through his personality, for example, then it would be even sadder if the ego exploited the creation of the internal bodies. Therefore, a greater power and a greater strength that person has managed to fabricate inside is now being exploited by the ego. This gives more power to the beast.
Quindi questo è un Hanasmuse, un individuo con doppio centro di gravità.
So this is what a Hanasmusen is an individual with a double center of gravity. Someone who has created a certain degree of light, but without reaching the end, not due to inability, but because he simply stopped practicing one or more of the three factors well at some point. So now the darkness that still exists inside of him, which he did not eliminate, takes advantage of that light that he has created. And this is what we then call the tenebrous ones, sorcerers, black magicians, witches, and so on. Therefore, there are 4 types of Hanasmusen, depending on how much light, depending on how many bodies and which bodies the person has created. So I repeat, to stop practicing correctly one or more of the 3 factors, or other types of errors, allows the ego to come and use whatever the person has managed to create of light, of white, of correct. So this is what the theme of Hanasmusen is about. Master Samael warned about this danger, which is for everyone, and therefore, as I explained, it has nothing to do with the justification of these people who say, don't teach others to transmute a lot because there's a risk of becoming Hanasmusen there. No, as I already have explained, we all risk of becoming Hanasmusen if we stop transmuting. We risk of becoming Hanasmusen if we stop dying. We risk of becoming Hanasmusen if we stop loving humanity selflessly, which means not to love just those who love you or whoever suits you, like your family, for example. So we are all at risk of becoming Hanasmusen if we stop practicing. Actually, I would say we already are Hanasmusen, or rather we're not even that, we're just black. Because Hanasmusen is a bit of white and a bit of black. Is an abortion of nature, a double center of gravity. We are simply black, and that's that. For the moment, at least. What we must do, thanks to a white path like Gnosis, through the practice of the 3 factors, therefore including transmutation, is to slowly become white, without stopping until we become completely white. So that we neither remain black, nor we fall into being grey or Hanasmusen, in other words. This would be the way, in my opinion, and I believe according to Master Samael's teaching, this would be the way to teach this aspect of the Hanasmusen, but also the point to which it was related, which is the theme of constantly transmuting, as I have indicated. For those who are starting, for those who are halfway through the path, for those who are almost finishing the 3 mountains, for those who have finished it already, etc., etc. That is, not transmuting is like saying don't breathe. It's really absurd. It's like saying don't eat ever. Well, you die in that case. In this way, you would die spiritually. Those people who teach to transmute little because God knows what risks there are and what risks there aren't, they forget that the risk is not transmuting. They say don't transmute too much because there are risks. So what they're actually doing is they're taking away one of the 3 factors, one of the 3 forces, one of the 3 columns, one of the 3 most powerful, very powerful instruments in the universe, which are the 3 factors. You are taking away this tool, one of the 3 most powerful tools to unite with a being. Okay, so I hope that anyone who thought like this or who teaches it like this can meditate on it for a bit. So this was the question that came from this person who wrote. Patrizia, as you thanked us, we also thank you for your question.
Visto che non sono arrivati altre domande, anche se volete, abbiamo ancora qualche minuto.
So since no other question has arrived, although if you want, we still have a few minutes. If anyone wants to write or ask comments or anything like that, you're very welcome. In the meantime, let's take a few more minutes to look at one last point. There were 4 planned, 4 organized to be discussed, so let's look at this last point. Actually, I hadn't even finished the 3rd point. I had forgotten to read a text by Master Samael, as I always have done so far, concerning this 3rd point, which was the work from the being towards the psyche, and not working or expecting to work, because it is impossible, to work the psyche, psychology without the being, without the contact and search for the being. That is through mysticism, love, mantra, all the Gnostic practices, but done with intensity and with continuity. So, the text is a text that explains this well. Of course, I had already read the chapter in Revolutionary Psychology, Prayer at Work, in the work, which was already very clear. But there is another text by Master Samael in his book, The Secret Doctrine of Anahuac, chapter 10, Gnostic Anthropology, where he uses exactly the same term that I used to title this 3rd point, that is, ontology.
Questo testo il maestro Samael dice: la rivelazione gnostica è sempre immediata, diretta e intuitiva.
Master Samael says, Gnostic revelation is always immediate, direct and intuitive. It excludes radically all intellectual operations of a subjective kind. It has nothing to do with the experience or with any set of fundamentally sensorial data. Although the intelligence or nous in its gnoseological denotation can be the foundation of illuminated intellectualizing, it categorically rejects backsliding into the mere intellect. The ontological and pneumatic and spiritual features of the nous, intelligent, are evident and manifest. In the name of truth, I solemnly declare that the being is the only that is real existence. Before his ineffable and tremendously divine purity, that which we call the I or ego, the myself or self, is merely outer darkness, cries and gnashing of teeth. Given the anthropological tendency of the pneuma or spirit, the autognosis or autognostic recognition of the being turns out to be unequivocally something that saves us. To know oneself is to have achieved identification with our own divine being. To know that one is identical with one's own pneuma or spirit, to experience directly this identification between the known and the cognizant, this is what we can and should define as autognosis. This extraordinary unveiling moves us to die in ourselves, so that the being can manifest in us.
Quindi il maestro qui sta dicendo chiaramente.
So, Master Samael is clearly saying here, is clearly focusing on the ontological, pneumatic and spiritual characteristics. So, contact with our pneumatic, spiritual, ontological part, which is the being. Only by starting from here, says Master Samael, I can know myself, I can know about myself, I can study my psyche, I can study the ego, I can experience real self-gnosis. Beyond this, there is no salvation, he says. Beyond this, there is no work, there is no self-gnosis, there is no revelation. But what these people would like is to die, but forgetting about the ontological, forgetting about the being. They don't get there, that is, they don't get to die or get to the being, or they believe they get there without practicing with fervent love, with mysticism. We need fervent love and mysticism to unite with the being, to feel the being, to remember the being, which in turn activates my consciousness and thus allows me to do the inner work. Okay, so this seems to me to be another current deviation of Gnosis.
L'ultimo punto che dicevo, che avevo preparato.
And finally, the last point that I have prepared for today that we can call missionary instructors. So at some point, Master Samael prohibited the existence of instructors in the Gnostic currents. Only the missionaries remained. An instructor is any student of a Gnostic center who, without becoming a missionary, begins to teach, or who depends on another missionary. So he goes to a city near where he lives, or to his own city where he lives. So that's an example of what an instructor is. So where does this come from? It comes from very far behind. It comes from the beginning of the Gnostic movement. But then Master Samael corrected this. Even he prohibited it, due to all the problems that this was creating, and which I will now try to summarize. So at the beginning of the Gnostic movement in the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta in Colombia, right at the beginning, when courses were being held for missionaries or even so-called instructors at the time, it is in fact true that the people who would finish this course were considered instructors or local missionaries, depending on how the course went. The abbots, the directors of that course, would appoint this person as local missionary, regional missionary, national missionary, or international missionary. So they would come out with 4 different types of missionaries, again, depending on the preparation they saw in that candidate. So, for example, the missionary called local missionary at the time was one who could teach Gnosis in his city or in a city close to his own. The regional missionary was one who could teach Gnosis in his region, for example, in Tuscany, as we are now, or in a region, in a department of that nation. The national missionary could teach Gnosis within his entire nation, for example, in Colombia, Spain, or Italy. And then finally, the international missionary who had no limits. He could teach anywhere in the world. So yes, this is true. It was born like this. Perhaps the error comes from there, from someone who has maintained this model or structure, who has not updated himself, who hasn't studied, and who hasn't come across all of Master Samael's teaching. Or, as it often happens, someone whose ego has taken whatever suited him, and whatever didn't suit him, he simply ignored or forgot. Or simply said, I don't understand this.
Bene. Perché il maestro proibì questo? Quindi i chiamati all'epoca istruttori o missionari locali e regionali sarebbero gli istruttori.
So why did Master Samael forbid this? Basically, the so-called instructors or local and regional missionaries at the time, who would be the instructors. So the missionaries would really remain only the ones who carried out national and international missions. Because being a missionary means that you leave your city, you leave your job, you leave your physical family, you leave in the sense that you move out. We move from our city to go to another part of that country or to another country, leaving our city of birth, our region of birth, and consequently leaving work, relationships, friends, family, and so on. This is a missionary. The instructors would be those first 2 categories that concerned the local or the regional missions. And this, I repeat, was eventually prohibited by Master Samael. Why? Because they created a lot of problems. What kind of problems? Well, initially and above all, I would say that if this person is not prepared, if he hasn't been prepared well, if this person doesn't understand the value of sacrifice because he continues to maintain his ties, he continues to keep his job, he maintains closeness to his entire family, lives in his city, in his context or comfort zone, well, disinterested sacrifice is something completely different. So, if this person didn't understand what the 3rd factor of the revolution of consciousness, sacrifice, means, then how can he transmit Gnosis well, since this is also one of the 3 pillars of Gnosis? So obviously this created the biggest problem, which is lack of understanding. As a result, he or she cannot transmit the Gnostic teaching well. This is the biggest problem. Before I carry on, I would like to clarify that there is no obligation to become a missionary. It is not the purpose of Gnosis to create missionaries. This is a very intimate, particular vocational thing. We are not proselytizers. We do not seek, Gnosis doesn't seek to foment the training of missionaries. The Gnostic movement was created by Master Samael to teach people, all of us, to work on ourselves with the 3 factors. That is the purpose of Gnosis, to work better and better over time with the 3 factors. Having said that, and on top of that, if then someone crazy like me gets the idea of leaving everything and doing the mission, then it's my thing, it's my choice. It's a vocation, or rather it's my being vocation. That's fine, but there is no obligation. Therefore, just as there is no obligation, neither there is a right. It shouldn't even be looked for. And if you don't fulfill the requirements, if you don't complete the requirements, it's better not to do it, in order not to do it badly. Better a good student than an instructor or a missionary who has no vocation, or who hasn't distanced himself from the circumstances where he has lived before. So this is an important thing to say. Then there were many other problems over the years that led Master Samael to say, that's it, no more instructors. For example, so-called auxiliaries who used to help missionaries. Also, they were instructors and they created many problems. Why? Now, imagine this situation. We are here in Florence. Imagine that now one of our students likes Gnosis so much and starts teaching in Prato, in Empoli or near here. Well, he creates his own group, he is a student, he doesn't have enough training, he doesn't break completely with all his circumstances, he maintains a Gnostic horizontal life, he maintains his job, he maintains his contacts, family, everything. Therefore, this is a Gnostic horizontal life, it is not a vertical pathway which is typical of those who undertake this path, that is, the missionary life. So first of all, this person isn't an example for others. Besides, no one is a prophet in his own homeland. He is not setting an example, so what can he teach you about Gnosis? What can this person say about sacrifice if he is Florentine and he teaches Gnosis in Florence? Example counts more than words. What kind of sacrifice can a person like this ever talk about? Okay, sacrifice is also working on oneself, surely. Sacrifice begins by working on oneself. We can develop a lot of third factor there. But if you put yourself in the role of a teacher, then you really have to transmit it fully, not only in working on yourself, which any common student can do too. You don't need to become a missionary to work well on yourself. Sacrifice here means that I will dedicate my life to the being and to humanity, and that I won't be comfortable in my environment, in my city, or in my family, or in my job. So it is by setting the example that I manifest Gnosis, otherwise words are empty. I think this is pretty clear. So this was to begin with, but many other problems would happen. For example, the so-called instructor, who had left a Gnostic center and therefore a missionary, would begin to teach in a nearby city, without setting the example, without comprehension of the third factor, without having the necessary preparation, and therefore would also sometimes enter into conflict with or contradict his own missionary from whom he had emerged. This instructor would never completely detach himself from his own center, which he had left, because he is an instructor, not a missionary. Therefore, he would also continue to be around his missionary and around the group he had left, but perceiving himself differently now, on an equal level as his missionary. Perhaps not mentally or consciously, but in the way he would act, yes, because when he would visit the center and his ex-colleagues or fellow students, he would start talking and teaching things, because he would also feel entitled to do so. And this would often interfere with the work of the missionary, with his pedagogy. He would even contradict it, or he would even create a small group. He would take his friends from that group he was part of and start to teach them different things, or the same things in a different way. So problems and more problems, which were happening in Colombia, in Venezuela, in all the countries where Gnosis began. So when Master Samael realized this, said, that's it, this is chaos, so there will be no more instructor. Whoever wants to teach Gnosis must become exclusively a missionary. Missionary, which means national or international, with the premises of what I said, that is, to break ties or bonds with the world, not only physically but also internally. Because a missionary is an apostle, is a pilgrim. This isn't a whim of contemporary Gnosis or of Master Samael, it has an esoteric reason, like all Gnostic teachings. It is not a doctrine invented by someone, it is a universal principle, a divine law. Just as this element also, which is part of the third factor, that is pilgrimage. So leaving your city to go far away and then move, wander like an apostle from city to city, from nation to nation, from continent to continent. And what is the esoteric reason for this, and not merely an act of madness or irresponsibility or fanaticism? Well, the esoteric reason is that if you don't wander, the Mercury doesn't wander. I mean, the pilgrim is the sexual energy, represented by the Apostle James. It is James who created the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, which is the city where I was born, Santiago de Compostela, Spain. Therefore, the journey of Santiago de Compostela, of St. James, is made by James, who is the apostle, the archetype of Mercury, of sexual energy. It's the god Mercury, as I also said in the first point, where we were discussing about transmutation, is the god Mercury which takes you to either the Olympus or to the Hades. So the Mercury moves, walks, leads the way. It's the traveler. Therefore, in order for the internal Mercury, the sexual energy within us, to wander, walk, get up, travel through vertebrae, bodies and so on, I must also physically accompany this by moving from city to city, from nation to nation. Because as it is inside, it is outside, as above as below. It's the first law of Hermes Trismegistus, the first universal principle of Hermes. As above, so below. As inside, so outside. So these are some of the reasons in order to make some Gnostic institutions understand, institutions which are multiplying like mushrooms by creating countless instructors, that the only thing that this does is to degrade Gnosis. Because the right conditions and the right premises aren't there. A missionary, who is not an instructor, must have known all of Gnosis, must have been part of the second chamber, of the third chamber, for years. If he doesn't know Gnosis, what will he teach? He will teach pseudo-Gnosis, yoga Gnosis, Catholic Gnosis. I don't know how to define it. So something very superficial, deviant, deviated. The excuse they often use is, well, at least I introduce someone to Gnosis, and then I take him or her to my missionary who knows more than me, who is more expert than me. Yes, but if the tree was already born badly, if the tree grows crooked, how will anyone be able to straighten it? It is from the root that we must make souls grow in a righteous and correct way. So these instructors who reproduce like mushrooms, the only thing they do is to transmit through their example a form of Gnosis which is not the Gnosis that Master Samael taught. Because it started off like this, but then the Master realized the mistake and finally prohibited it. There are written letters in which he says instructors are prohibited, auxiliaries to missionaries are prohibited. Due to these problems, conflicts that I won't tell you about because we would be talking here for hours, that have created all these circumstances.
La parola istruttore viene presa dall'istruttore del mondo.
Well, we could also say that the word instructor in reality is nothing less than a word taken from the instructor of the world, that is, the teacher of the world, Yeshua ben Pandira, the Venerable Master Aberramento, the Divine Solar Logos. He is the instructor of the world. Therefore, the word says it all. So you can't be an instructor of a city right next door to you. You can't be an instructor who maintains his own home, his own family, job, because the word comes from the teacher of the world, Yeshua ben Pandira. And we all know his story, his life, that he sacrificed his life to give it to others, to dedicate it to others. Therefore, the aim of the Gnostic mission, of the Gnostic teacher, is not to become a professor. He is not a professor. He is not a Gnostic manager. He or she is someone who feels that urge in life, that is, to completely break ties with the life he's been carrying on so far. A life which, with all respect, anyone can follow. I repeat, there is no obligation to become a missionary. It is not the aim of Gnosis to become missionaries. But if one wants to do it, he must do it well, correctly, at least. Correctly, we demonstrated already with our work, but we must also have the physical conditions. We must start from there, from the physical requirements. After that, I will of course continue to work on myself to be a worthy Gnostic and therefore also be a worthy teacher. All of this is part of the true third factor, which is called disinterested sacrifice for humanity. For humanity doesn't mean that if I'm in Florence, I sacrifice myself only for the Florentines or for the people of Empoli or the people of Pistoia without ever leaving this place. It's called sacrifice for humanity. Therefore, humanity doesn't only live here around Tuscany. For example, we've done missions in many parts of the world, and this is what a missionary is. This is what a missionary is. Above all, it means sacrifice, and sacrifice means that I must sacrifice my own life voluntarily for love, without expectations, without desire, without expecting a reward, but for the benefit of others, not for my own benefit. For example, I do this, I do the mission because by doing so I live the inner path. No, that's not the right way. Sacrifice is this. I sacrifice the life that I had, the stability, the comfort, the city, the contacts. Oh, but it's difficult, some might say. Well, of course it is. That's why it's called sacrifice, precisely. But I repeat, no one is asked to do this. Gnosis invites us to work with the three factors, and that's it. So being a Gnostic teacher or missionary cannot be considered as a second job. It's not a second job. It's the only job. The rest is for survival. So, if my studies were in architecture, for example, I would work as an architect or with whatever I could find in one city or another. I've done all kinds of jobs, anything I could find, when there is nothing else, but, that's only to survive, to pay the rent and so on. So I'll do whatever I have to do, whatever I find. But if my economy allows me to, I won't even work in order to be able to fully work on myself and for others. If the Gnostic group allows me to do that. Physical work is secondary, it comes after. What comes first is the only true job, the one I voluntarily chose to do. That is the Gnostic teacher, the missionary. It's not like I first sort out my business in the world and then I become an instructor, as if this were an accessory to my life, in the sense that the free time I have available, I dedicate it to teaching Gnosis. No, this shouldn't be done this way. This isn't for a student who's trying, who wants to be an instructor. Master Samael forbade this. If one wants to prepare as a missionary, then that will become his life, his only job. If he then has to find a job in the physical world to eat and to pay rent, he will find it. But this becomes a secondary thing in order to survive, and not the other way around. That is, I maintain the false security of my job, of my family, and then I dedicate some time to teaching Gnosis. I'm sorry guys, but this is not how Master Samael taught it. This has nothing to do with being a Gnostic teacher. This is not the third factor. Well, I think that's enough. I prefer to keep it short. Perhaps for me it was short, maybe for some was too long, but I prefer to keep it short so as to also give the opportunity to reflect and see if there are any questions. If not, if there are no questions, then maybe next time. We hope with Radio Koradi to be able to do a second and a third part. So anyone who wants is also very welcome to ask about today's meeting, about today's conference if necessary. That's all from me. Thanks for listening and wish you all well.